الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين. Dear friends and brothers and sisters, a whole year has passed since I had the privilege of speaking to you here last year, and many tragedies have added already to the difficult situation that exists within the Islamic world and for Islam as a religion, while also many important positive steps have been taken. And I'm glad that this conference itself is now playing a very positive role in trying to achieve goals which are oftentimes neglected by so many Muslims who talk about Islam without really paying attention to what Islam is, not to talk of those who are against the very ethos of the Islamic tradition. The title of my talk tonight was not decided by myself, although I modified it somewhat, but by the organizers of the conference, and I think by my dear friend Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, A World Out of Balance. But I was very glad to address this issue for you. It's a very, very crucial issue. I do not have that much time, only 45 minutes. But I shall try to do the best I can to bring out what is really at play. All Muslims in this room have heard, even if their mother tongue is not Arabic, the Arabic saying, "Khairul umur awsatuha." That's a kind of a proverb in which we live. That is the best of things. Here the word amr really means thing, not command. The best of things is the medium, is the middle, is to keep the center. And you all know that the Quran refers to the Islamic people as ummah wasata, the middle ummah. In what way are we middle? That's a very important issue. But in any case, our tradition has always not only supported the middle, moderation, the mean, but always opposed what we call in Arabic ifrat and tafrit, that is extremism of one way or another. But why is it then we live in such a world, and this is not only of the Islamic world, but the whole world, the world that is marked by so much extremism? Today it's mostly Islam that is accused of extremism, but modernism itself, its whole self is extremism. That is the replacing of the divine reality by human reality as the center. That is therefore removing the divine center from human life. And the consequence of it has now spilled over into other civilizations. They're not only Muslim extremists. Everybody who's making money from morning to night is an extremist. Everybody who's spending all of his or her energy and amassing wealth is an extremist. Everyone who tries to enjoy himself from morning to night and do nothing else is an extremist. Extremism is much more profound than the labels which the modern world loves to create, vilify, and then stick on the forehead on whomever they do not like. And this usually happens to be the case of Islam. We first of all make a word, vilify it, and then describe our enemies by it. That's the method that is used all the time. It's a method well known to the German fascist party and the Nazi party in the Second World War, unfortunately also emulated by many others. Now, look at the world around us. The person who introduced me spoke about wealth and poverty. At no time in human history have we had such extremes of wealth and poverty as we have in the world today. For centuries, since the 18th century, the Europeans, when they conquered the Islamic world, used to criticize Islamic societies for having extremes of wealth and poverty. I remember when the Americans first came into the Islamic world after the Second World War. I'm a Persian living in Iran at that time. They always criticize us for, oh, you have 1,000 family rich people, everybody else is poor. But any Muslim traditional society, from the poorest to the richest, never has had the disparity of wealth and poverty that exists in the United States today, where the middle class is being completely eliminated, where trillions of dollars have flowed since the 1960s from the middle class to the rich. Where a janitor makes $12,000 a year, the CEO of the company makes $30 million a year. There's never been in human history such disparity. So it's not simply the question of a few rich Indians or Pakistanis or Egyptians or Persians or something. Rich and poor has always been part of human history. The Quran speaks about the rich and poor, Ghani and Faqir. But the extremism that we see today is unprecedented. And it's not the fault of the Islamic world, it's one of the conditions of our world. Everything I speak about today really involves the whole globe, but also us, and I shall come to what we can do about it. Then we have another form of extremism. We just so-called celebrated the birth of the people, of a person whom the Christians consider the Son of God, and we Muslims as being one of God's greatest prophets, the prophet of interiority, who lived with simplicity, with poverty, who only had one dress. But no single religious event has been as commercialized as his birth in human history. Consumerism has devoured this being whom God sent to the world. I got so angry, I always do it during Christmas when I see this. I always say the corruption of the best is the worst, as the medieval European saying goes. When something religious is corrupted as the worst thing of all, that someone should come along and remind people that Christians say that God sent his only Son into the world, but should add that send down Son into the world so we could consume more and more at Christmas and the businesses could thrive. This is an affront to all religion, but there it is. Consumerism has become the new God, and it again pits those for whom artificial needs are created all the time to buy and buy and buy and throw away and throw away and throw away, with those who are very poor, who cannot even find the necessities of everyday life. It is amazing, simply amazing. We've never lived in a world like this in which a cup of coffee, a cup of good coffee in New York costs as much as the food for 2 weeks of someone in Bangladesh, the poor people in Bangladesh. It's never been in human history has there been such a thing. Then we have another form of extremism. On the one hand, we have a highly cerebral, I would not call it intellectual, cerebral part of the population, which is always thinking about different things, sciences, social sciences, thought, this and that, and emphasizes the importance of thinking. At the other end, we have the hedonism, which was never observed on this level before. The only thing comparable to it is what the Roman emperors and their entourage practiced in Rome before Rome fell. There's complete hedonism, a life given to pleasure, completely to pleasure, which is totally at the antipode of all the science and technology and things like that for which the West is also known. And then we have, on the religious level, a polarization which has been very rare in human history and which threatens the very existence of all religions, and not only Islam. And that is, on the one hand, what is now called fundamentalism, on the other hand, modern nihilism. That is, you have a part of the world, especially in Western Europe, where 40% of people are atheists and another 30% agnostics, where a country like England, only 5-6% of people go to church, in Sweden only 3%, in France, the bride of the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, only 8-9%, and most of the people are atheists. At the other end, we have people who are killing for God, so they think, and they're not only Muslims. The Army of God in Kenya and Uganda is not Islamic, it's Christian. And the BJP that massacres Muslims in Gujarat is not Muslim, it's Hindu. So it's a global phenomenon of extremism at the expense of religion itself. I could go on and on. Our life in this world is marked by extremism. And every religious person, whether Muslim or otherwise, has to carry out a spiritual jihad, an inward effort, to try to be able to recreate a balance within himself and herself. Now, if we are thinkers, we first of all have to ask the question, why is the situation like this? What has caused this extremism? Why is the world like this? There are always extremists in the world. In European history, in Islamic history, in Hindu history, in Buddhist history, in Chinese Confucian history, but there was always a much more limited phenomenon. Why is it we're faced with this incredible meeting of extremes? The answer metaphysically is very easy to understand. Especially from the Islamic point of view, it should be very easy to understand. What prevents extremes is the center. And extremism in society comes from extremism within the souls of men and women who comprise that society. Once in the soul, the center is lost. All of the elements of the soul turn toward the periphery, towards the extreme. And this is really the spiritual, metaphysical reason why there is extremism. Once modern man decided to substitute terrestrial man for God, which happens with modernism during the Renaissance and got worse and worse until today. That is dethroning God on earth. Whatever goes on in heaven is irrelevant for modern man, but dethroning God on earth, removing divine institutions, divine norms, divine laws from everyday life, and therefore from within the souls of human beings. A person is born oftentimes into a world without center. Everything that we do is centerless, almost. Modern art is an art without center. It has no center. Modern science has no center. Modern philosophy has no center. Social institutions do not have centers. And if they claim to have a center, then they say, oh, you're absolutizing and so forth. Look where we have gotten, where even the guardians of the truth, which are religious institutions, like the Catholic Church, which is the most important Christian institution in the West, nobody ever talks about the truth anymore. The truth is out of fashion. Nobody talks about it anymore. Because once you talk about truth, you have to talk about error. And you have to come back to the center where the truth resides. You all know the hadith of the Prophet, ﷺ, قَلْبُ الْمُؤْمِنِ عَرْشُ الرَّحْمَنِ, that is the heart of the believer, is the throne of God the compassionate. God resides at the heart. Heart means center. The center of our being is the heart. Heart is another word for center. Heart and center are spiritually the same thing, the same word. And therefore, God resides at that center. And it is He alone who can pull all of the tendencies of the soul from extremism and preserve a balance. And once we decide, because He's given free will to do so, to forget Him, not that He goes away, but for us He's no longer there, then all the centrifugal tendencies of the soul become much more powerful, and everything gradually flows away from the center. This, I think, is the deepest reason why we have extremism in the modern world. I don't think anyone has ever analyzed it along these lines. We have many fine young scholars. At this age that I'm in, I usually just throw out a few sentences, and mashallah, they develop wonderful books out of it. But I hope someday somebody will pursue this more fully. I believe that there is a metaphysical nexus, relationship, between extremism, which manifests itself externally and socially and militarily and economically and politically and everything else, and of course, our soul and what goes on within the souls of men and women. Once we lose our own inner center, it's impossible not to have extremism. Because to have balance, you have to have center. Like the children play with the fulcrum that goes up and down. They balance each other, but because it has a point in the middle, the fulcrum, which is center, which is through which you're able to balance the game that children play. Without the center, it's impossible, it's absolutely impossible to avoid extremism. The great tragedy is that many people in the world today, although they realize this extremism, do not want to look at the real causes. One of the greatest tragedies of the modern world is that people try to cure a malady with the same germs that cause the malady. We do that over and over and over again, and nobody is willing to look outside of the box, as they say, outside of this paradigm which has created this unbelievable mess, which is going to catch up with us, because one of them, of course, implies that we are consuming with an infinite rate something finite. That is, this way of living, of extremism, is destroying the very environmental foundations of our existence on Earth. An issue to which I will not go today, but there would have been no environmental crisis, of course, without the appearance of this extremism. The very idea of progress means extremism. That is, you're not satisfied with something, you always have more. It's an abstract idea of progress and progress and progress, but to what end? Where is the end of it? And since the more and more and more becomes prevalent, we have no choice but to destroy the finite cosmos, the finite world of nature in which God has placed us. So many people are aware that there's a very great crisis afoot. Environmentalists, social scholars, some theologians, but I've met very few people who are really willing to point to the real deeper causes why there is this extremism. And the deeper cause is a spiritual and metaphysical cause. Intellectually, it's the loss of a vision, intellectual vision of reality in which the center is the center. The divine is the center of all things. There is ultimately no other center but the center with a capital C. God, who is the heart, who resides at the heart of all of us, as I read the hadith for you. And outwardly, more outwardly, within the human soul, the center which balances the various tendencies and proclivities of the soul. You all have one thing in common in this vast room, and that is one being whom you know directly, that is yourself. You have direct experience of yourself. You might not know your sister that well, or you might know her well, but that's still indirect. You yourself all know yourselves. You all know that all of us carry within ourselves these tendencies towards the extreme, you might say. And something controls us. The something that controls us is the center. Once there's no center, why not give to extremism? Any of these forms of extremism. Some people have the thirst, lust for power. They don't care about wealth. They have lust for power, and they go to extremes. They crush anybody on their way in order to gain power. Some people don't care about power at all. They're after physical pleasure. They don't want to get powerful. They want a physical pleasure all the time, and so forth and so on. What keeps the soul in check is that center. And once the center is gone, the only thing that can control extremism is external forces. That is, if I try to have power, another general comes and does a coup d'etat and hangs me, that kind of thing. Or if I try to become very rich and destroy the head of another company, they win out and my company goes broke. External forces, but internally, inwardly, the only thing that can control is very violent and powerful forces within the soul of all of us. Towards extremism is the center that holds it together. And once it holds it together, it is able to transform those very tendencies toward the extreme to that which can be balanced and brought together. Through all spiritual effort, through all religious effort, we cannot destroy what God has created. That is within our soul even. We cannot destroy anything within our soul. What we can do, however, is to transform it, the power that God has given us. I was to say, to rearrange the furniture of the soul, to in such a way that these diverse tendencies balance each other out. And at this point, we come to what Islam says, and we see how different it is from the prevalent worldview, which pushes not only non-Muslims, but many Muslims towards all kinds of extremism, with which now Islam is being stigmatized, but it's not certainly unique to Islam. Now, in contrast to extremism, as I read for you at the beginning, Islam always emphasizes lack of extremism, balance and harmony. What does harmony mean? We always talk about it. Harmony is the manifestation of the one in the many. It's the reflection of God in manyness, in the created order. That's the metaphysical root of harmony. That's what harmony is. Without the one, there's no harmony in the real sense. And Islam seeks to establish the presence of the one in the many in such a way that the many always contributes to the one. Let me be a little bit less abstract. What do I mean by that? Let's say in this way that the presence of God in our life is such that whatever we do brings us back to God. Whatever we do, not only the 5 daily prayers, whatever we do, we always think of God, be brought back to God. That's what harmony is. That is to have always the awareness of the center of the one in the manyness of our lives, and of course in the universe as a whole, which directly is not our business. Islam, because of its emphasis on harmony and mizan or balance, which always related to harmony. Like musical harmony has to have balance of various notes, otherwise you cannot create musical harmony, every form of harmony. The balance, the mizan, which Surah Ar-Rahman speaks about so much, and it's not only the physical balance to buy cucumbers at Khan Khalil Bazaar in Cairo. Mizan is also theological and metaphysical metaphor and symbol in the Quran and Islamic thought. To create mizan, to create a balance, goes with this harmony. In order to do that, the first thing that the soul has to do is to realize its own center. That is to realize this hadith, that God resides at the center of our being. He is closer to us than our jugular vein. The Quran has so many majestic, poetical, very powerful expressions of this nearness. In fact, of course, it also says, God says, I am near. This nearness, which is at the center of our being, for each of us to realize that whatever we do, wherever we go, God is at the center. Always be aware of this center. It's very difficult, very, very difficult, because the soul has a tendency to want to run away, to forget, to disperse. But change this and bring it to the center. All of religion is for this and nothing else, to bring us back to our center. All the rights, all the laws are for this one point and nothing else. And once we realize that God is at the center of our being, then try to live according to not extremes of ifrat and tafrit, but to be in the middle. That is moderation. Now, moderation, it can be an ugly word, and I want to make clear what I mean by moderation. First of all, in politics, oftentimes people are moderates who try to avoid any position whatsoever. And it's not, when I say moderate in this sense, I don't mean that two people are fighting. One person says 2 and 2 is 4, the other person 2 and 2 is 6. The moderate comes and says, oh, don't argue, let's make 2 and 2 5 and let's all be brothers. This is the history of the modern world. This moderation leading to error. I don't mean that at all. I mean moderation is against extremism. Islam always emphasizes this moderation, but some forms of moderation are not good. For example, our reliance upon God should be absolute. We should not only moderately rely upon God, we should not only love God moderately, we should not only be good to the neighbor moderately. In fact, those are qualities which come from God and reflect His absoluteness. These we should be absolute about, so do not mistaken me. My word, do not mistake my word. The word moderation, therefore, is a very tricky word. We have to be very careful how much this defines it. It's a wasted word in the modern lexicon, and I don't usually use it. People ask you, are you moderate? I said, no, I'm not moderate anything. But important for me is the truth. I'm almost always classified as a moderate Islamic thinker. But that doesn't mean anything as far as I myself understand myself. For me, it doesn't mean anything. But moderation, in the sense of avoiding extremes, becomes a consequence of this awareness of the center, of awareness of the presence of God in us. Why? Because the divine revelation of Islam is based so much on that, perhaps explicitly more than any other religion. Let me clarify this. First of all, the Quran itself refers to God as al-Dhahir wal-Batin. God is the outward and the inward. God himself is the outward and the inward. This is perhaps the most difficult verse of the Quran to understand. How can God be the outward? Isn't this the outward? Isn't this table the outward? Astaghfirullah, how can God be this table? And thousands and thousands of pages have written about what this means, into which I cannot go here, obviously, but this is the verse of the Quran. God decided to call himself both al-Dhahir and al-Batin, because ultimately, actually, of course, there is no presence but the divine presence. Everything that is in its being is God. But that subtle metaphysical point is lost upon most of us. So let's just understand in its ordinary sense. There's this outward opposition between Dhahir and Batin, outward and the inward. But God being both outward and inward means that in our life, we must create a balance between the outward and the inward. One of the greatest achievements of Islam as a religion was that for 1,200 years, until the blasphemies of the last 200 years in the form of modernism and neo-Wahhabism and things like that came into the fore, Islam was able to preserve, better than Christianity, better than Judaism, better than many other religions, a perfect balance between the outward and the inward, avoiding disequilibrium. There were occasionally small groups that went one way extreme, other way extreme. But the main body of Islam was able to preserve this balance. And the health of Islam as a religion, and the fact that it's today so much alive, that there are 30,000 Muslims in this room. But if you were to have a conference on Christianity in Iraq, even when Iraq had 1 million Christians, there would not have been 5,000 people there. The fact that Islam is so much a living religion, in spite of us, not because of us. It's because of God's will. We don't deserve it, any credit whatsoever. Because of God's will, has to do with this preserving this balance, which many people in the modern world, because of this extremism, are trying to destroy. You have a lot of Muslims who are against the inward dimension of Islam today, and they don't understand that they're cutting off their nose in spite of their face. That without the inner dimension of Islam, Islam could not provide answer for many major questions which human beings face, which have always been answered by the inner dimension of Islam. And soon Islam would be faced with the same situation that Christianity faced after the Renaissance, when it destroyed its own inner dimension. And many intelligent people left the church one after another. Secularism began in Europe, not in the Middle Ages, but with the rationalism of the 17th century, destruction of the inner dimension of the Christian tradition, which we see before our eyes in many parts of the Islamic world. Some people are trying to do. But traditional Islam, what I speak about, always, I represent traditional Islam, always guarded this balance, preventing extremism of either the inward alone or the outward alone, always preserving a balance. Another very important balance, trying to preserve a balance and not allow extremism, was between what we call ibadah and mu'amala. That is aspects of the Sharia, the divine law, which deal with worship, ibadat, and aspects of the divine law which deal with transactions, mu'amalat. Part of the Sharia has to do with that devotion to God, praying alone, turning ourselves to God, not thinking of the dinars in the bazaar while we're doing it. Part of the Sharia are just the reverse. How to make a dinar in a halal way. In case young people don't know dinar, I mean a dollar. I don't want to use the word dollar. Anyway, how to make wealth in a halal way and the laws that are related to it. So you have in the very division within the Sharia of the mu'amalat and the ibadat, a way of preventing extremism. This is extremely important for especially Muslims living in the West, because there are many Christians in the West who have turned to social action as their participation in religion against contemplation and inwardness and worship. That for them is their worship. And there are many who have been against the contemplative orders in Christianity, which play such an important role historically with the preservation of Christianity, including the establishment of Quebec, right next to you, to this province. Who was it who first established Quebec? It was actually contemplative orders of the Catholic Church at first, at the very, very beginning. So the idea of preventing one to becoming extreme or the other becoming extreme, that either immersing yourself completely in social action or drawing completely from social action to devote yourself only to ibadat, that itself was one of the great marks of genius of Islam to prevent. So you had in Islam, in contrast to many religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, and Christianity, although they had great saints, of course, of all kinds. I'm always respectful of all religions of God. But in Islam, what was characteristic is that you oftentimes had a man who was a merchant in the bazaar, but was a very great saint. Or vice versa, a man who was a beggar, who was also a great saint. You had warriors like Abdul Qadir Jilani, Al-Jazairi, Abdul Qadir Jazairi, the 19th century hero of Algeria, who was at once a great military hero and a great Sufi and master of the inner sciences and a great saintly man who saved, including many Christians, in Damascus when he was exiled there. So Islam has seen people who would be people of action, but inwardly devoted to the spiritual life, or devoted to the spiritual life, but at the same time performing action. The kind of extremism in social structure, which you see in certain religions, in which you have monasticism and so forth, you do not see in Islam, but the meaning of monasticism, that is inner withdrawal to be with God, is inculcated in all believing Muslims by the Sharia itself, not to talk about the inner path, the tariqah, and other things that exist in the Islamic world. Another very, very important dichotomy which Islam tries to prevent is what the Quran keeps referring to as the dunya wal akhirah, that is this world and the hereafter. Always this dichotomy is drawn. But how is it drawn? How is it drawn? First of all, Quran wants to make clear that the hereafter is better for you than this world. Al-akhiratu khayrun lakum min al-ula, as the Quran says. This we all know. So there's a kind of priority. However, each has its own reality. The dunya is to be shunned if it prevents us from living well and preparing ourselves for the hereafter, for the akhirah. But one cannot completely disregard one's duties in the dunya. That is, if you talk another language, Islam is opposed to both excessive worldliness and excessive otherworldliness. And that is best exemplified in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, who changed human history as no human being had ever done. He changed the whole world. But at the same time, he was never worldly. He's used to spend the last 10 days of Sha'ban and all the days of Ramadan usually in spiritual retreat, i'tikaf, in Mecca when he could. Although he was the head of a whole world, he was like a king, he was a leader of a whole community. So this refusal again, to go to extremes of only thinking of the hereafter and not caring about responsibility in this world, or only caring about this world and not the hereafter, is again one of the remarkable achievements of Islam, to create this balance between them. Of course, in our world, there's not much fear of people leaving this world for the hereafter. You won't meet many of those. It's the other category you will meet all the time. People who forget where we come from, why we're in this world, where are we going, and cling to this world as if they were going to live forever. But nevertheless, both possibilities exist. Anyway, my time is coming to an end, and I have to wrap up. Altogether, Islam, in order to preserve this balance, this harmony of life, advises its followers to avoid excesses. Even wealth and pleasure. Wealth is not forbidden in Islam, but is excessive amassment of gold and silver, which was symbolized wealth, and which in the language of the Quran is always decried, is always opposed. And Islamic law was such that if practiced correctly, did not create the difference between the CEO I just mentioned to you and the janitor in some building on Wall Street I just mentioned for you. There's never been that much of a disparity in traditional Islamic society. The richest merchant in the bazaar might have 100 times more than the person who swept the bazaar, but not 10,000 times more. So excesses of wealth were always avoided. It was considered to be evil. Not wealth to be evil, but excessiveness. And the same was true of pleasure. Islam is not against pleasure. I don't mean pleasure in the sense of spiritual pleasure. That's something that God gives, and there's no end to it. But I mean sensuous pleasure. Islam is not against that, against eating, against sexual pleasure, all the things that God has given to human beings. But again, always avoiding excess. The great message of Islam for its followers, and now for the whole world, is to be able to live in balance and harmony and to avoid excess. That is, to try to live in the center. But that is impossible. God will not allow it in the forgetfulness of God. There's no possibility to forget God and live in peace. There's no possibility of forgetting God and not having excess in the soul. Those are impossibilities. It's like so many modern people who want to be atheists and be peaceful and blame war on people of religion. They don't understand that God would never allow such a thing. God, that's not the purpose of our being in this world, to live in peace and forgetfulness of God. We are to live in peace and the remembrance of God. God himself is salam, is peace. Metaphysically, how can you be at peace when you deny the source of all peace? Now, this is also true very, very much of this balance that Islam mentions, and which can only be gained by gaining access again to the center of our being, where God always resides. And my last advice to this vast gathering, if it's going to take something with you and not wasted 45 minutes of your life, to remember is that there is no happiness in excess. Any happiness that comes from excess is very transitory. It's like a person who's a glutton, and for half an hour he eats and eats and eats and he enjoys himself, and then he gets a stomachache for the next 12 hours. There's no possibility of pleasure indefinitely. We all know that. Any kind of physical pleasure. Same with other excesses, which are psychological or mental. We must remember that happiness, which we all seek, comes not from excess, but from harmony and balance. And that harmony and balance can only come about by returning to our center, by remembering that God resides in our center. And that without that center, human life cannot have ultimate meaning. And so when Quran says, "I'tasamu bihablillah jami'an wa la tafarraqu," that is, all cling to the cable of God and do not disperse. It also means inwardly, all the forces of our soul should cling together as a unity which reflects the center of our being. Thank you very much. I pray for all of you. My time is up. and I don't want to be late.